everyone, and welcome to Coast Connections from home. On this episode, we're going to go from the front lines of this pandemic to the front lines of World War II. And can you imagine going onto the front lines as a soldier armed with nothing but a camera? May of 2020 marks the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, the end of World War II, 5.5 years of destruction and fighting. Today, we want to mark that anniversary with stories of encouragement, of triumph, and friendship. And to help us do that, we're going to go to Halifax to historic Pier 21. And our guest today is Dan Conlin. Hello, Dan.
Hello, Liz.
Hello, Dan. And you're a curator there with Pier 21 in Halifax.
Yeah, I'm in charge of temporary and traveling exhibitions at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. We do shows all the time, and we have some across the country. In fact, we have a show about refugees. It's at the Nanaimo Museum right now, as soon as it reopens when things get back to normal.
Perfect. And we were one of the first places this traveling exhibition came to, weren't we, Dan?
Yes, the Nanaimo Museum has been quite interested in some of the traveling shows we put on for the Canadian Museum of Immigration. They've taken two of our big shows and currently have our favorites so far, all about refugees and their journey to Canada.
Wonderful. Well, we're happy to support our East Coast friends on this endeavor, and we're happy to have you here today as well, Dan. Pier 21 was a very strategic port during World War II. And just to provide context for this, the pier actually was the place where about 500,000 Canadian troops exited or disembarked for Europe during that time. That was quite a very, very busy port during the war years, wasn't it, Dan?
Oh, yes. Pier 21 was sort of a linchpin of Canadians going overseas. It was built as an immigration terminal for people coming to Canada, but immigration is slow to trickle during the war, and instead we became ideal to send people overseas. Pier 21 has an enormous wharf. You could put two of the biggest ocean liners in the world end to end and have the trains pull up right next to them. So it was an ideal place, and almost all the 500,000 or so Canadians who went overseas from Pier 21. So it was all through the war. You'd have these train cars with hundreds and hundreds of cars coming from all across Canada, arriving and boarding and often leaving in great secrecy at night to go over and fight our battles overseas.
Mm-hmm. And of the 1.1 million servicemen and women that went over, as you say, more than half of them went through Pier 21. So a very, very important place. And I visited there several years ago, and it was really nice to see that you actually have the original World War II deck still there and the doors that the troops came to and from. And there's a place there where Canadians can buy plaques to commemorate those. It's called the Wall of Honor. And we just want to let people know at pier21.ca, you can find a little more information about that, how you can support the museum and keep this history alive. It's very important that we don't forget the sacrifice of our troops.
Yeah, that area, we call it the gateway. It's the place where the gangways went up to the ship, and literally you're walking on the same concrete where over 400,000 Canadians took their last steps as they went overseas. So it's a very powerful place, and you can look out there across the ocean to the far-flung battlefields that they were headed to. It's a powerful, reflective place, and it's a place that Canadians can share their memories and that we share their stories that we have.
Very important. And it's actually a National Historic Site now, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, we're the last surviving ocean immigration terminal, the place where for many generations people came to Canada by ship, and we're the last place where the building still survives and the hull still survives. The train tracks are still outside. So because that status in the late 90s, we became a National Historic Site. We became a National Museum 8 years ago. So we tell the story not only of the building where I work, but also of immigration all across Canada.
And just to let our viewers know, this is part one of a part two interview that we're going to be doing with Pier 21 to talk a little bit more about its significance in history during World War II in particular. So, Dan, you're not only a curator and a historian, but you're also an author. And you've written a book on a topic that probably few Canadians know about. I was really intrigued to learn about the Canadian Army Film and Photo Unit. Like, who knew that there was 75 of them that were commissioned to film and photograph the war right on the front lines?
Yeah, a very brave and determined group of 75 men and women who created all those images that you see every Remembrance Day. And every time that you watch a documentary about World War II, you'll see the movie and the still photos that this group of Canadians took to capture history and keep the kind of the World War II morale up. And they were a really unique unit. So when I was in university, I thought somebody should sort of do a study of who these men and women were who created those images. That is a major part of how we perceive the war today.
And you've captured that story beautifully in your book that you've authored called War Through the Lens, Dan, and that's available widely for people to purchase. And it's also, there's a lot of information on the Pier 21 website about the story behind your book as well. So thanks for capturing that very, very important piece of history for us, Dan. Now, how did these 75 people come to be recruited? Like, were they photographers before? Did they have any experience? How did they form that unit?
Well, when you joined the Army, you filled out a personnel form where you listed all your job skills and where you'd worked. And when the Army decided, rather belatedly in 1941, that it had to have a special unit to capture pictures, they went through looking for anybody who had film and photo skills. And it was a bit of a challenge because Canada had just a tiny film industry in 1939. It was all controlled by Hollywood. But they found sort of people who worked for the big Hollywood newsreel companies. They pulled people who ran little kind of home photo studios or did home movies. And they all called them together. They were determined to have the Army sort of film and photograph itself. So they were looking at men who and women who were already in uniform could understand how the Army worked. And so they pulled these folks together. Some of them had deep experience, but some of them, had shot a few home movies and helped up with film portrait work. And then as the unit grew, they would often find that their drivers, the men who drove their Jeeps and gave them covering rifle and machine gun fire, were interested in filmmaking. And then they brought in folks with no film background at all to make this unit that captured really kind of epic material.
And this unit, it was comprised of Canadians from all across the country, wasn't it, Dan? Every province.
Yes, it was really represented. Nice contingent of photographers and cameramen from BC, but also lots of folks from the East Coast. As you might expect, a ton of people from Montreal, which is where the little bit of the Canadian film industry was in 1939. But one of their drivers who took the camera into battle was from just outside of Halifax, and that was one of their casualties, killed in Normandy. So they were really right across the entire country.
And they did suffer a high casualty rate, didn't they, Dan? This group of 75.
Yeah, so for such a small unit, they had 6 killed and about 30 wounded. So you're getting a pretty high percentage of the unit that were either killed or wounded during the war. And many of those survivors and veterans, they carry little bits of steel shrapnel in their body to the end of their days from those artillery bombardments that they lived through. So it was dangerous work. They were determined to shoot as much of the battle as close as they could get. In an era before, fancy telephoto lenses or night vision cameras. And that meant finding the fighting and getting as close to it as you could, often shooting from a tripod in the open. And that was very dangerous work.
Now, Dan, you've had the pleasure of interviewing about 16 of these members of the Canadian Film and Photo Unit, and you have their oral histories here. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in oral history, that you can learn important things by having people remember things. Gives you a sort of counterpart to the written record. And we're big believers in oral history at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21 because people's stories about coming to Canada tell you way more than just a passenger list does. So I started learning oral history when I was an undergraduate student in the late 1980s. And this was the point where the Army film and photo guys were holding a series of reunions where they got together all those years after the war to share memories. And I had just learned about this unit, so I managed to meet about 16 of these fellows and a couple of the women, and did oral history interviews where I recorded their memories of the war, and so I could tell the story of who these people were.
Well, lucky are you. What an honor to have interviewed them and heard firsthand. Let's introduce our viewers to 3 of those today, Dan. First up, we're going to have Corporal Grayson. Here he is in his, I believe, a slit trench here. He's digging. And this chap was only 17 years old, I believe, when he joined up.
Yeah, Alan Grayson, cocky young kid, lied about his age to get into the army, and it was kind of outspoken from the beginning of the war to the end of the war. You see him in that picture. He's got a dig in a trench in Normandy, wearing a stolen American infantry helmet, and he was, background in home movies. He'd done a little bit of portrait photography, but he was with the unit when it was first created and saw all the campaigns. I mean, he went ashore with the Canadians in Sicily and Italy, fought in the Italian campaign, and then was transferred to Normandy, and also worked for a time in the base studios in London. And interesting fellow, he kept getting promoted and then demoted because he would shoot his mouth off. And he was just as candid when I interviewed him in the 1980s about sort of, good decisions, bad decisions. And he was quite a fellow. He was supposed to go in on the ill-fated Dieppe raid in 1942, that very costly, bloody raid where Canada raided a French port, and it was a disaster. And it was supposed to be filmed by the Canadian Film and Photo Unit. At the last moment, the British decided, we don't want any cameramen in, we'll send one British cameraman. And Grayson was so angry about not being able to follow the troops he'd been training with that he went to the headquarters of the Army Film and Photo Unit and shot it up with a pistol. And so it said to me, well, I got demoted to private for a few months after that. But he was a very skilled man, and was kind of back in the front lines as soon as they landed in Normandy. So yeah, a really interesting fellow, and he captured a lot of those classic battle shots that you'll see in all those documentaries nowadays.
Wow, what a brave fella. And there was also a woman on the team, Corporal Karen Hermiston. Tell us a bit about Karen.
Yeah, so the Army Film and Photo Unit had women working in their studios doing the editing and producing the film. But, the sexist norms of the day, they didn't have any women shooting the battle in the front line. But Karen was experienced sort of a newspaper style photographer, and she covered all the Canadian troops in England. All the training, the official events, the ceremonies, and got beautiful shots of VE Day 75 years ago in the Trafalgar Square in London, for example. A tiny woman, but one who was able to charm herself into the ideal vantage points. And so she was our female lens on the war during World War II. Fantastic.
And Sergeant Game, there's a photo of him here in Ortona, Italy, I believe it is.
Yeah, that's a powerful picture. When I met George, he had that photo crumpled up in his wallet, laminated, just so he could show people what he kind of went through. Because he's filming in an olive orchard that's full of German bodies. It was a bloody counterattack that these fanatical German Panzer Grenadiers had launched, and he was just filming amidst this carnage. And it just gives you an idea how close these men and women were to the death that war is all about. And initially the Canadian Army was very squeamish about showing any dead, even German dead, but gradually that kind of changed. And so he covered both the Italian campaign and the Normandy campaign. And he was quite candid, too, about how gradually, psychologically, the fear and danger of filming in the front lines kind of built up on you. And eventually he was evacuated out of Northern Europe because his nerves were really kind of getting to him. But he kind of still produced reel after reel of this battle footage.
Wow. And how traumatic it must have been, too, from those receiving the film and the photos, developing them and seeing a lot of gruesome photos. That must have been very, very difficult for those not only taking the footage, but processing it as well. We're going to show an iconic piece of film here, Dan. It's the Juno Beach landings, the black and white film that most people are familiar with and think of D-Day or World War II. But just talk us through how this footage was actually taken that morning, June 6, 44.
Yeah, it's this very powerful kind of eyewitness. It's a point of view film. You feel like you're at the landing craft with those men because that's where the cameras were. The head of the Army Film and Photo Unit had managed to get a series of about 30 what they called stick-on cameras. And they were cameras with a magnet you could attach to the side of the landing craft. And so each cameraman was given a bunch of these cameras, and they were responsible for filming a regiment, and then they distributed them to the different landing craft. And so the cameraman would tell the naval coxswain in charge of the landing craft, listen, when you're about a minute out, hit this button and just let the film roll. And and then after the landings, the landing craft that didn't get blown up, the cameraman then rounded up this film and sent it back. If you look very carefully at that film footage, the full 6 minutes, you'll see it's actually 3 different landing craft that are spliced together. But the one powerful shot is it's a landing craft of the North Shore Regiment of New Brunswick. And that's the wonderful, great shot as you see them get closer and closer, and the door finally opens. There's those bleak, scary-looking houses and a machine gun swept beach. And the soldiers tumble out with all their gear, and one of them turns back, and he gets a slap on the shoulder as a reassurance from one of his mates. So it's an amazing bit of eyewitness film footage. It's the best film footage from D-Day taken by anyone. And so it was this carefully thought out preparation to capture this image, and then an elaborate system to round up the film on the beaches, get it sent back to England, where the whole team of people were waiting for this film to be developed. And it was being shown in movies theaters all over North America within a day and a half of the landing. And it gave Canada's sort of contribution to D-Day great visual recognition.
That's amazing. That's just amazing. And what obviously this doesn't show is the noise and the smoke and the smell. I mean, there was 10,000 aircraft, 5,000 ships. It was just an amazing armada that left that morning. And the sounds of the destroyers and the mortars, it doesn't capture any of that.
That's a perceptive question. All this film was shot silently at that point. You couldn't record sound in the field, so it was shot silently. And then in London, they had recordings of all the different types of weapons and aircraft sound effects, and they would sort of layer that in. And I remember, some of the more seasoned members of the unit saying, "Listen, we got some great shots, but you can't smell the bodies. You can't smell the cordite from the ammunition. You can't feel the ground shaking." There's visual depictions give us a lot about what war is like, but they don't tell us all kinds of other things. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you see those images.
Now, Dan, we've got the story behind the story of the iconic image of the soldier with his hand on his comrade's back and the fellas looking back. You've identified who that is now. Tell us a bit about that picture.
Yeah, this just recently came to light. For years, we knew the regiment was the North Shore Regiment of New Brunswick, but it turns out a young fellow, Private White from Liverpool, Nova Scotia, is that man, and he just died about a year ago. And he survived the fighting, he survived the war, and he kind of went back to Liverpool to work in the woods after the war. But you capture him as kind of an ordinary person at this extraordinary event.
He's the young fellow looking back, isn't he?
Yes, we're not quite sure who the hand is with the wedding ring that you can see that slaps him on the back, but that's the fellow from Liverpool kind of looking back at you.
Remarkable. And that actual image has been made into a coin by the Canadian Mint. It was for the 75th anniversary of D-Day last year. They captured that image from that footage, and it's now a Canadian coin.
You can't get more iconic than that.
You can't. Now, Dan, tell us a little bit about how the footage and the images came from the front lines to the front page and to the theater screens. What was that process like? How do you get film footage off the front lines and over home?
Well, they had an elaborate system in the field, like a headquarter unit just behind the lines, and then drivers who would take the cameraman into the battle and then rush the film back. And then motorcycle drivers who would drive it to the nearest airfield would be flown to England and then sent to the studio, had their own processing labs, and then they had editors who would go to work. The cameramen and the photographers also would type up detailed narratives of what they were filming with the names of the units and the battles were being fought, the weapons were being used. And then these film editors would put together these newsreel stories. First, they had to get them by the censors, though, who would immediately take out all the names of the units and anything that might compromise security or any film that was too bloody or disturbing. But then the rest would be released to newsreel companies. Before the era of television, people got their news by going to a movie theater where you would watch like a newscast in the movie theater. And these big mostly American newsreel companies distributed film all over the world. And every neighborhood theater would have the stories of the week. And these Army filmmakers would make these short newsreel stories. Eventually, they did 6,000 of them about different battles and preparation and training and new weapons. And they would be put together as these stories and shown all over the world. And so there was this big little filmmaking unit that worked there. They also made some really thoughtful documentaries. That's where the women in the unit played a much bigger role. So and I interviewed one of those female clerks, Nadine Manning. She remembers some of the film coming from the field with these hastily scrawled notes on it. And in one case, I think it was some film Alan Grayson had shot. His driver had been killed while he was holding the film cans, and there was still blood all over the film cans. And Nadine Manning still remembered sort of getting this bloody roll of film, and it gives you an idea just how close to the carnage of the war that these fellows were.
Unbelievable. That's just remarkable. The courage that took, and how they sort of normalized it, in their day-to-day lives out there. 5.5 years they were out shooting footage to be, kept for all time. Now, Dan, what kind of equipment were they using back there in the 40s?
They were using what would seem to us today to be very simple but very heavy and rugged equipment. The still photographers had these big bellows still cameras, graphite cameras, and then the motion picture photographers had these little IMO 35 millimeter cameras. So they would shot a nice wide negative, but you had film reels that only had about 2 minutes of film on it. And the film itself was incredibly flammable. If any cameraman was hit by an incendiary bullet, he would have gone up in a ball of flames because the film was really, really flammable. And all shot in black and white. And they were also drilled to use tripods. The editors in London wanted good, steady shots that they could edit well to tell a story. So they were sort of drilled that no matter how much artillery rounds are landing, you set up your tripod. And they, in order to sort of exist with the modern reality of mechanized warfare, they had all kinds of tricks to do. Some built tripods out of rifle stocks, and they knew how to kind of shoot in danger with this equipment.
Remarkable. Now, Dan, what happened to the group of the surviving group of the 75? How many came back to Canada, and what happened to them? Did they go on to bigger and better filmmaking things, or?
Well, they came back to build Postwar Canada, and like so many other Canadian veterans, some of them the war changed them forever, and they came back as skilled filmmakers to play founding roles in the beginning of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation television, or in the great post-war expansion of the National Film Board. And one of them, Mike Spencer, one of the editors in London, he went on to play a big role at the NFB and founded Telefilm Canada, a giant in post-war Canadian film industry. But other guys just went right back to their small towns. I mean, they had a guy named Ken Ewart, who was just an amazing editor, and everybody expected him to, be a big, glamorous Hollywood type after the war. He went right back to his farm in Alberta because he loved farming, and so they were really kind of a cross section of kind of post-war Canada, it was quite interesting to interview them later on in years. Some of them had this very glamorous war and then led ordinary lives. Other of them played big roles in the post-war Canadian media scene.
That's amazing. And of course, that was, the CBC wasn't around then, and the National Film Board wasn't around then. So that came out of this film and photo units, the genesis of both of those.
Certainly CBC radio was around, but CBC television was yet to be created. And when it was created, some of the guys directing those first Canadian TV CBC cameras were old film unit guys. The NFB had created just at the beginning of the war, and the National Film Board and the Army Film and Photo Unit had a somewhat uneasy relationship. As one of the guys said, we were Army guys with our crew cut hair, and the guys in the NFB were the artistes who thought they were Hollywood, and the two of them didn't necessarily get along. But the NFB, for its powerful World War II documentaries, depended on this really riveted, powerful film that was coming from the front lines. And so they had a relationship which produced some great material for history, but it was an uneasy relationship during the war.
Mm. Dan, you must have had so much fun researching this book and just learning about these unique people and the unique role that they played during the war. I just got a couple minutes left, but I just want to introduce one ray of sunshine. It's Staff Sergeant Ray Varney. He's sitting here. He's holding up the newspaper that declared the surrender of Nazi Germany, the end of World War II in Europe. He purchased this newspaper. He was a D-Day veteran, and he actually volunteered for the Pacific war battles. So he came home. He was on one of the very first troop ships. There's a picture of the actual troop ship, the first one back after the war. Again, shot by a great shot by one of the photographers there. 7,600 troops on that New Amsterdam vessel that came through. And Ray kept that newspaper and those photos for 74 and a half years. He died a few months ago, but lived a very full life. And those are very, very precious images to him. And it speaks to the importance of the film and photo unit. So I would encourage viewers to source out your book and read it, because it's a fascinating part of Canadian history and something that I think will inspire other people to get involved in film and photo work as well. Pier 21 in Halifax is just a wealth of information, and you've got a really good app that's available now because the museum's obviously closed for the time being. Tell us a little bit about how people can access the resources there.
Yes, we put a lot of work into putting our collection online, and there's everything from a database of all the ships that came to Pier 21, tips on researching your family history. We got great assortment of images, a lot of interviews too of immigrants and stories of wartime soldiers and their stories of deployment. Ton of material on our website. We've also been boosting up our YouTube channel to sort of put more video online. So there's a heck of a lot about the history of immigration that you can learn from our website, the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, and also great tips you can learn about how to trace your own family tree, whether you came through Pier 21 or not. We have such a wonderful family history research library, and they've put a lot of their skills online, what we call the Scotiabank Family History Research Center, to help people explore their own roots in peace and war.
Fantastic, Dan. It's been very nice sharing a screen with you today, all the way from Halifax. Appreciate you coming in. And we encourage viewers to contact the museum and the resources there. And we're going to be doing a part 2 of this interview. And we're going to be concentrating more on the war brides and the children that came back after World War II. So thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the work that you and your colleagues do there at the Pier to keep this history alive. And it's a very important part of Canadian history that we need to acknowledge, especially during this month of the 75th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. We hope you're staying well and washing your hands. Enjoy the freedoms that we have today. And we will see you next time for part 2 of the Pier 21 interview. Thank you.